talk about film is that everyone should be on the right page, but that's kind of the problem. No one is on the right page. In most film reviews, one would merely just give a synopsis, but even this is difficult, and no one is going to be wiser when I describe the story, and in fact, even more confused. So our introductory synopsis only serves to remind those who have seen the film of the major events that take place, so we can better explore it later. So you're gonna have to stick with me here. The film's prologue involves the main character, Henry Spencer, floating in space. A planet shaped as an egg is behind him. Inside this planet, a man moves levers in a shed. The man in the shed pulls a lever. Henry speaks out a sperm, and the sperm-like thing falls in a white puddle. We then emerge from a hole, as we were a child coming into the world. There is a flash of light, and we see Henry looking back at the audience with dread. This is the first act proper. Henry walks home with groceries, explores his desolate town, gets his sock wet. He rides his elevator. The elevator doesn't work. Then he gets word from the beautiful girl across the hall that his ex-girlfriend named Mary wants to have him over for dinner. Henry hangs out in his small apartment where he throws his wet sock on a radiator and rummages in his drawer. The night where he meets Mary's parents is awkward to say the very least. He meets his ex-girlfriend's parents, Mrs. and Mr. X, who keeps a smoking, paralyzed grandmother in the kitchen. Mary's mother asks what he does for a living. Henry says that he's on vacation. Mr. X is a plumber who lays pipes and had arm surgery. When they sit down for dinner, they carve man-made chickens which erupt with blood when Henry carves them. This somehow leads to the revelation that Henry is a father to a child.
Answer me.
I'm too nervous.
There's a baby. It's at the hospital.
Mom!
And you're the father.
But that's impossible. It's only
Mother,
been...
they're still not sure it is a baby.
It's premature, but there's a baby.
This is the end of the first act. When we first see the child, we see that's a horrific, monstrous-looking creature. It's not fully born, and it won't stop crying. And Mary is repulsed by it. While Mary looks after the child, Henry finds a seed in his mailbox cubby. He doesn't tell Mary about this seed. During this night, Henry wants to have sex with Mary, but she refuses. The baby's incessant crying leads Mary to leave after only one night. This is our midpoint. The baby gets sick. Henry, being a terrible father, wants to check the mailbox and leave the baby behind, but can't. Henry goes to bed and sees a lady inside a radiator squashing sperm. From this, he wakes up finding these sperm things in his bed, alongside a wet-haired Mary who has magically come back. He throws these sperms at a wall, which opens a flower cabinet, which causes a seed to crawl up a hair mountain and opens its mouth, which contains Henry's reflection in an image in a puddle. The girl across the hall asks to sleep over because she got locked out of the apartment. Henry then submerges himself in a white puddle with the girl across the hall. The girl across the hall sees the egg darting towards her. We get a song number from the lady in the radiator. Henry goes into the radiator and then opens her hands, which causes the screen to change to white. We see the man in the planet again, this time replacing the lady in the radiator. He brings out a giant wilting tree, much like the one Henry keeps unpotted by his bedside. Henry goes behind an obstruction, and then Henry loses his head. Is replaced by a baby. The tree starts bleeding, which sinks Henry's head and makes it fall down to an alley. The head is carried by a kid who brings it to a factory where they use his brain for a pencil eraser. Afterwards, Henry wakes up and realizes that the girl across the hall is not with him. He sees a murder outside, beside a puddle. This is our second act break. Henry knocks on the girl across the hall's door. No one is home. He lays in bed and hears people outside. He sees her with a man. She looks at him and she sees him with the head of a baby. Henry, then in a fit of rage, kills his own child. The lady in the radiator embraces him. Cut to black. The end.
What the hell was that?
In a 2014 interview with Vulture, David Lynch, upon being asked, "What's the strangest thing anyone has ever interpreted from Eraserhead?" David Lynch, like he always does, dodged the question. I like to have people be able to form their own opinions as to what it means, and have their own ideas about things, but at the same time, no one to my knowledge has ever seen the film the way I see it. The interpretation of what it's all about has never been my interpretation. And with this revelation that a near 45-year-old mystery had yet to be discovered, I began to write a book in hopes to uncover it. Sadly, at the time of writing, most of the discourse surrounding Eraserhead has dissipated. People have opinions, sure, but people seem to engage in it on its more aesthetic level, without a proper cohesive viewpoint. Again, I must reiterate, there is no wrong way to approach Eraserhead, with the exception of perhaps pretending it means nothing. And if you somehow saw Eraserhead, or any David Lynch film, and you felt something, I cannot take that away from you. Neither do I pretend to be an authority on any text. To make sense of the senseless, I scoured everything from art books, academic papers, archived forums, and web pages. I dove through bargain bin books on cinema, old documentaries, and racks upon racks of horror fanzines. I came to the same conclusion that Lynch did, even 7 years after his interview, that almost all these theories were touching upon something, but this something was still somehow incorrect. From there, little by little, piece by piece, something new would catch my eye. Eraserhead is a magnet of a film. It has that effect on you. I found myself watching it again, and again, and again. During the 2020 global pandemic, I took on this project in quarantine in almost total isolation, which I don't recommend. My goal here is to write a book. Eraserhead is just one chapter in it, a skeleton key to the works of David Lynch. I'll try to keep you updated on that as I produce more content. You can ask 1,000 different people what Eraserhead is and get 1,000 different answers. Even today, it's hard to get people to agree on the same central themes. Press a person too much and the conversation oftentimes devolves so that certain signs and certain symbols merely are there to express a mood. Critic Remy Dean states that what it's supposed to mean is pretty irrelevant. Like the works of many gifted songwriters, it has emotional authenticity without being particular to an individual experience. I mean, I can kind of agree here. If there's any film worth analyzing for its aesthetic quality, it's Eraserhead. However, analyzing only the aesthetic qualities of the film limits it in scope. But my goal here is to open up Eraserhead to new discussion. Now, the most common and least likely interpretation is that the film is merely a joke, meant to shock, offend, and baffle the audience, and has no intent. It doesn't seem likely at all that a group of students would dedicate a large portion of their time, money, and effort to a project that means nothing. Lynch invested 5 years of his life to this project, enduring homelessness and hardship in the process. The film is filled with reoccurring imagery, a structural through line, and an incredible depth in its characters. It has meaning. The second most popular theory of what Eraserhead is actually about is the theory that the film is about the birth of David Lynch's daughter and his contempt for her. Jennifer Lynch, in a Chris Rodley's 1997 interview says, "I was born with clubbed feet, and people have made insinuations about it because the baby in Eraserhead was deformed. I don't think David credits that directly as where Eraserhead comes from. The fact that this theory has gained so much traction is a bit baffling. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the themes, subject matter, and the making of Eraserhead. One could only imagine David Lynch dedicating 5 years of his life to a horror movie about murdering his own daughter. For some, I believe my arguments will be like speaking a foreign language as I pick apart seemingly mundane occurrences or see something as having a symbolic importance that to many might not seem to be. This is healthy, I think. Some will latch onto my theories much quicker, which is harmful. In every viewer, I ask for two things. One, for skepticism, to further this discussion of the work, and two, to come in with an open mind. Before I try to establish a thematic through line in the works of David Lynch and Eraserhead, I want to look at what other critics have to say about Eraserhead. In The Impossible David Lynch, Todd McGowan, who is a brilliant Lacanian, reads it as a Marxist film, seeing its factory setting as an exploration of Henry's alienation under capitalism, despite Lynch's known conservative worldview. Greg Olson, in his mammoth biography, David Lynch, Beautiful Dark, writes that the acne-cheeked lady in the Radiator is a force of good that tells Henry to liberate himself from the baby by killing it, similar to David Lynch, who doesn't make time for his own children. Olson regards Henry as an ordinary fellow, a continual victim of circumstance. Killing his child wins him his prize. He also believes that the lady in the Radiator is David Lynch's celibate religious guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Olson then pairs some of the imagery to the Gnostic Bible, and then asserts that Eraserhead has a happy ending. Dennis Lim seems to be unsure, not taking a position either way in his book David Lynch, The Man from Another Place. He believes that Henry may have a happy ending, that may not be one. David Lynch Decoded, by Mark Allen Stewart, raises the question if the manifestation of the woman in the Radiator is morally righteous or not, but seems unsure. He doesn't write that much about Eraserhead, probably about 6 pages. Agency and Imagination in the Films of David Lynch by James D. Reed, and Candace R. Craig is more interested in the psychological or the philosophical underpinnings of Henry and Mary's character than to fill in the gaps of the mysterious ending and the symbolic what's what, only to guess that, much like the man-made chickens, the baby too may be inorganic. For Catherine Coulson, the assistant director, but better known as the Log Lady in Twin Peaks, she says, "I'm reluctant to interpret his works. When people would ask what Eraserhead was all about, we would just say it's a simple love story." For Jack Fisk, the actor who played the man in the planet, he says that Eraserhead is about karma. I didn't realize it when we were working on it, but the man in the planet is pulling levers that symbolize karma. For Charlotte Stewart, the actress who played Mary X, says, "What does it mean? To me, that's like asking what Monet's water lilies mean." For Jack Nance, the actor who played Henry Spencer, he says, "You guys get way too deep over this business. I don't take it all that seriously. It's only a movie." Now, David Lynch's works is not about one thing. To simply just minimize an artist's expression to one simple idea would be ridiculous. Exploring Eraserhead, we will pick apart certain themes and motifs throughout the film, but don't mischaracterize me into saying that all of the film is X or that all his work is Y. That is not what I aim to say. But if there is one thing I believe stands out narratively in most of his works, with little exception, is Lynch's interest in the deterioration and the preservation of the family unit.
Oh my God! Oh my God! No, 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 no. 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 No, it's not him. No, no, it's not him. It's not. It's not him. It's not him. No.
Richard never had a father. I remember writing. My father got me this old Schwinn, secondhand. He painted it green, got a new seat for it. Two-tone green, kind of a lime green and a deep forest green. Fat tires. Oh, it was so hard to ride, but I loved that bike. I love that bike. I'd ride with my friends. I love that bike. I love that bike that my father got for me.
Often Lynch characterizes the American family to be violent, abusive, in disrepair, and without love. And The Grandmother, Eraserhead's sister film, tells the story of an abusive father figure who berates a bedwetting child. The boy who lives in a home without love manages to grow a grandmother in his attic with a magic bag of seeds. In Blue Velvet, Dorothy Valens is extorted by the evil Frank Booth. In order to safeguard her kidnapped child, Dawn, she must perform sexual acts for Frank. Frank Booth, during his sexual assault, takes on the role of a child in his sexual play, often screaming for his mommy. The protagonist, Jeffrey Beaumont, is missing a father figure as well. This is where his journey into darkness begins. Dorothy, who's nearly old enough to be Jeffrey's mother, has a love affair with Jeffrey. During Jeffrey's first encounter with the mysterious Dorothy, Dorothy calls Jeffrey her son's name while having sex. Which brings us to the abusive, incestuous, sleazy mother, Marietta Fortune, from Wild at Heart, who tries to sleep with her daughter's boyfriend, and then tries to keep the two apart, going so far as to hire a hitman to kill the father-to-be. In Eraserhead, we too see an incestuous kiss from Mrs. X, the conservative mother who comes under the spell of her dog-like urges. Killer Bob is the most infamous example of the broken family unit in Lynch's canon. The incestuous, abusive spirit causes a father to rape and kill his own daughter. John Merrick of The Elephant Man is a fetus-shaped man whose mother abandoned him as a child, contrary to his historic mother who died when he was 18.
I can't. I gotta go.
You're choking me, aren't you, baby?
No, I ain't, sugar. Ain't nothing wrong with you. It's just us I can't handle.
David Lynch's performance of Industrial Symphony No. 1 at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in New York City had him string nearly 100 plastic babies from their umbilical cords. David Lynch was quite the opposite of the avant-garde image he presented. Lynch saw the LA hippie scene along with its drugs as a waste of time. And as the 70s went on, Lynch and his acceptance in the community of transcendental meditation then led his views to become more and more conservative and spiritually driven. He stopped drinking, eating meat, and stopped smoking, at least for a while. Jack Fisk says that there are so many spiritual things in Eraserhead. David has always been that way, and has gotten more spiritual over time. Eraserhead came to Lynch in fragments first, but the ideas were truly presented him after a chance encounter with a line from the Bible. Lynch vowed never to speak this line. David Lynch's paintings during the 5-year production of Eraserhead are surreal drawings of a religious nature. Some pictures are alien-like landscapes framed as if they were windows outside a church. Worthy of note in his Eraserhead period are the paintings Crucifixion, Third Ray, and Infusing the Being. Crucifixion is the most easily identifiable piece of religious art during this era. The painting seems to take heavy inspiration from Christ of St. John of the Cross by Salvador Dali. However, Lynch's depiction of Christ's martyrship is presented as a tangled and half-born dysmorphic figure. Lynch, during this era, most likely due to the recent birth of his daughter, excitedly drew art depicting life and the creation thereof. An untitled piece depicts a phallus-shaped object ejaculating into an ocean of color, with sperms floating along its current. A vibrant circular egg is behind its horizon line and colored in a vibrant, beautiful hue, symbolizing this fantastic miracle of conception. This is far from the cold, industrial creation that Henry Spencer envisions creation to be. Judging by his art, it is apparent that perhaps at one time maybe Lynch could have been a hesitant father, but by the time he began working on Eraserhead, he seemingly had nothing but love for his child. In many pieces of concept art that directly depicts either Henry Spencer or the baby of Eraserhead, Lynch primarily was focused on the insides of the baby and the killing of the baby. In one piece of art, the baby appears on an ultrasound, yet to be born, a cord strung around its neck. Another sketch, drawn earlier, depicts a surreal abortion, a fetus crying while its head is being cut open. A thought bubble is drawn around the crying fetus's head with an image of a peanut. Wild at Heart uses a similar peanut nickname for Lula Fortune, our conflicted mother figure.
Peanut!
The visual metaphor of the piece is cartoonishly simple, as peanuts are containers which hold seeds. In other words, it's crying out for its mother. Another untitled church-like drawing has a similar peanut motif, and much like all these church drawings, they are seemingly surrounded by an orifice-shaped surrounded window as to represent a vaginal cavity. The peanut levitates inside this window. Also, what appears in the same fetus-killing series is a can opener, positioned in front of a vaginal train tunnel, which in an absurd way seems to complement the cutting of the dysmorphic fetus. In the works of David Lynch, abortion is almost always framed vaguely. There are some rare exceptions. One of these exceptions are of Wild at Heart's original script, which paints the procedure as a horror show rather than a relatively safe operation at the choice of the woman. Although Barry Gifford's book mentions Lula's abortion once, it hardly goes into the detail that Lynch does in his original script. Most of the abortion elements in Wild at Heart, thankfully, have been minimized in the final cut of the film to be much more tame. Some of the deleted scenes are still available for viewing on the lime green box set. However, we can briefly characterize Lynch's less surreal framing of abortion through its initial script and therefore how he views the procedure. He frames it as follows. Cut to interior abortion clinic, Miami, day. Extreme close-up of dying fetus with 120 decibels. Lula screams over. The fetus twitches in its little pot of blood. Extreme close-up of pulsing vein in Lula's neck. Loud, violent heartbeat sound like a double pedal kick bass drum of Lula's forehead covered in sweat, running down to her eyes, open wide and wild. Extreme close-up of fetus in medical trash can. Extreme close-up of bloodied abortion instruments. It kind of goes on.
I've been hypnotized or something.
Hypnotized?
I'm gonna kill someone.
Oh yeah? Who are you gonna kill?
I don't know.
Who hypnotized you?
I saw him looking at me once when I looked around the bar, and he said that I would know who it was.
How are you gonna kill this person?
With a screwdriver.
To better understand the narrative framework of Eraserhead, one just needs to look towards the film's ending. Following the infanticide of the child, the baby transmorphs into an egg planet, the same one that we see at the beginning of the film. Inside the egg planet is a cancerous man holding onto his levers for dear life. The egg planet is cracked apart. The man in the egg dies. Being that the child, upon its death, appears to transform into an egg, we can assume that the ending is not depicting an infanticide of a baby, but rather an abortion procedure. This is most likely the reason the baby in Eraserhead looks the way it does throughout the film, as it most likely is a stand-in for Mary's in utero baby, as the actual baby has yet to be born.
There's a baby. It's at the hospital.
Mom!
And you're the father.
That's impossible. It's only
Mother,
been...
they're still not sure it is a baby.
Like the man in the planet, Lady in the Radiator, as well as the totality of the nightmare dreamscape around Henry, Eraserhead's premature baby is likely imagined in order for Henry's psyche to play out his fear of fatherhood and resolve the ethical dilemma of whether or not to keep the child. It seems that he doesn't, however, taking the advice of the sperm-smashing Lady in the Radiator, who tells him, in heaven, everything is fine.
Just cut them up like regular chickens?
Sure, just cut them up like regular chickens.
The dinner scene lends credence to this unborn narrative, as the small, man-made chickens
Smaller than my fist!
brings to mind a unit of measurement worth using to describe a small, unborn baby. It is undercooked, brought forth to the dinner table, and when cut, leads to the spilling of massive quantities of blood from the chicken's orifice, reminding us of the conception and alluding to Mary's lost virginity. Not only that, due to the amount of blood, it seems to be referencing the procedure and the cutting and the killing of the baby at the climax of the film. A small detail here is that Mrs. X, the conservative mother, reaches for these man-made chickens as if trying to protect them, as if she sees innate value in the chickens even if they are undercooked. Even so, Henry carves it anyway. This cutting seems to spark a seizure for Mrs. X, similar to the baby's expression while it is being cut open, a further visual pairing to the film's climax. This also pairs twofold with that of an orgasm. Her groaning is a reaffirmation to us of what has been revealed. This, of course, being that Mary and Henry had sex and that Mary is pregnant. This leaves both Mrs. X and Mary X bolting for the kitchen. When Mrs. X comes out of the kitchen, she politely escorts Henry to the back hall, not before Henry sees a light bulb erupting. Illuminated by this light bulb is an egg and its nest. another reference to the death of the child. The first act is punctuated by Mary asking the film's key philosophical question.
They're still not sure it is a baby.
Mrs. X, the mother in charge, assures them it is a baby, then tells Henry the child is at the hospital.
It's premature, but there's a baby.
And the rest of the film deals with the moral dilemma of whether or not Henry wants to take on the role of fatherhood or not. It's Mary's child, of course, but this is Henry's dream. So I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. The dinner scene makes no sense unless we apply a metaphorical framework first. Is there really a baby at the hospital just, hanging out, while Henry and the gang just eat chickens? Like, maybe this is a thing that happens in Eraserhead land, but it is far more likely that this is meant to substitute something else entirely. This narrative is a dream, and therefore has symbolic stand-ins like a dream. The question we as an audience should be asking is, why is the baby like this? Why is it half-born? And why does it come into the story so suddenly?
It's at the hospital.
Mom!
And you're the father. After the two of you are married, which should be very soon, you can pick the baby up. It's premature, but there's a baby.
Should we take this sudden turn of events at face value, or is there something more? Does it make more sense that Mary had a child, or that Mary will have a child? If we go with the latter rather than the narrative structure we have been going with for the last 45 some odd years, things make a bit more sense. Everything clicks into place a bit better once we take the baby as metaphor, not yet born. Eraserhead is a dream play of dark and troubling things where Henry's subconscious needs to work out whether or not he wants to take on the role of fatherhood. By looking at our symbolic egg as unhatched, we better ease out these weird plot inconsistencies. Like, for instance, Mary X as a character. She makes no sense, like, in story terms. Like, wouldn't Mary's mom and dad notice the pregnancy? We know that Mary still lives with her parents because she moves back in with her parents when the baby becomes too much of a hassle for her. But in this analysis, we need to recognize that these characters are symbols first, more so than characters. They may not make sense because dreams rarely make sense. Charlotte Stewart, who played Mary X, at one point said that she was supposed to be cracked open like an egg as Henry pulled sperm from her body, but the effect looked bad and she just disappears and reappears from the final film when the dream narrative needs her. In other words, she's not real. This whole thing is a dream. It's not real. Generally, when abortion is depicted in the films of David Lynch, it is depicted in the form of metaphors. For example, in Eraserhead, we get a metaphorical abortion signaled by a back alley, a child, and an eraser machine operator. In the dream, Henry's disembodied head falls from a checkerboard stage onto the ground, cracking his head wide open, leaving his brain exposed. His brain looks much like an egg and is picked up by a child who brings it to a factory to be operated on. And from Henry's egg brain, a pencil machine operator creates a material for erasing. Henry describes himself as a printer on vacation. To be on vacation is to be free from labor. A printer works in permanence, but Henry wants to be free from such responsibilities. In other words, Henry made a mistake that needs erasing. In the dream sequence, it's a child that brings in Henry's head, as if a stand-in for a physical child the operator is erasing. We see also much the same procedure of extraction in Lynch's little-known short, Out Yonder, Teeth, in which Austin Lynch, the real-life son of David Lynch, has his teeth pulled by his father. A child, much like Eraserhead's back alley child, watches as blood pours from Austin's oral cavity. And just a quick side note, the same parent-child casting was also done in Wild at Heart with Diane Ladd and Laura Dern, real-life mother and daughters who are cast in similar roles. The script reads as if Lula's mother is symbolically painfully aborting her own child, much like how Lula literally painfully aborts her own child.
Abby's being hungry. Abby's being hungry. Abby's being with some hunger as well. UB is going to get us some food here.
In the David Lynch art book, Images, Lynch photographs dentist work, reminding to seek preventative measures at home so they don't have to go and see the doctor. The series of images are bookended with a medical trash can, much like Wild at Heart's medical trash can. After that, a picture of a wallpaper of a smiling baby with white teeth, grinning ear to ear. A wallpaper perfect for a newborn baby's room. Henry's brain eventually gets turned into a pencil eraser. The operator draws a line and erases a small section of the line. The transition from pencil eraser dream is through a eraser dust that gets brushed off by the side of a table. And then we see an interesting directorial choice here. If you tilt your head, you can see this image of Henry stretching out of bed, which looks like a pair of knees. This is with the overlapping of eraser dust, but the darkness that the cinematographer, Frederick Elms, seems to bring in this scene here seems almost as if we are seeing a pair of legs. Situated between these two legs is Henry's head and hair, which doesn't help matters much. So, in between a pair of legs and eraser dust, or erasing in between a pair of legs, we once again get another abortion motif. After we see poor Henry dogging about, his bedpole in his hand, we get the scene where Henry sees a murder outside. It's funny to me that Henry just doesn't care. He just goes about his business afterwards, pursuing the girl next door. But like all things in the stream narrative in Eraserhead, this too is a symbol. Since he's peeking out of his window framing, a framing that we can all pretty much agree is a symbol of his own freedom or lack thereof. Now notice how he's viewing this murder through a slit framing. It would make sense that the murder occurring beside a vaginal puddle would be foreshadowing Henry's eventual decision to abandon the child for his sexual pursuits and leave Mary to inevitably terminate the pregnancy. Or how the film frames it, he physically cuts open the half-born baby and then falls into the open arms of the lady in the Radiator. So, as we discussed, David Lynch's windows are often framed as vaginal, and I believe it works its way into Eraserhead as well. Windows are representative of freedom and the freedom to engage in sexuality. It also seems to convey the outlook of characters, and here, yes, Henry's bricked window is vaginal. Like the bricks in front of his vaginal window is symbolic for the lack of sex he is going to be having. And here's one of my really uncomfortable hot takes, being that he is viewing the window through a slit framing while we see a murder beside a vaginal puddle. It could make sense that the film compares abortion to be likened to a literal murder. It's really hard to divorce Eraserhead, a movie about killing a half-born baby, from anything political. Trust me, I've tried. Especially that certain elements of the film was written into production months or so after Roe v. Wade became law. I believe that the film is talking about back alley abortions, so the film is not talking about the legality of abortion. I think it's more interested in the spirituality and the ethics of abortion. That's just my interpretation. The lady in the Radiator serenades Henry to kill his child, a embodiment of Henry's pent-up lust, dressed up as the idealized woman, Marilyn Monroe, with big smiley cheeks. She smiles, reassuring that in heaven, everything is fine, failing to mention the death that comes first. At the end of the film, after Henry has terminated his symbolic fetus, Henry is seen in a heaven-like landscape, free from the responsibilities of fatherhood. The lady's views towards children are blatantly anti-natalist. She squashes symbolic unborn babies as they fall onto her checkered stage, signaling she will retaliate against these unborn creatures if this fantasy girl gets pregnant. And like the Queen of Chess, she is untethered from where she can go. The two other scenes that we can see the lady in the Radiator in is when she reaches out to Henry, holding her fist in her hand. Recall how Mr. X refers to the chickens to be as big as one's fist. The lady in the Radiator opens her fist and reveals nothing is inside. Henry takes her hands and a white light appears, and what comes from it is a suction sound. This most likely signifies a vacuum aspiration abortion procedure, in which the fetus is sucked out of the uterus. The same procedure is depicted in Wild at Heart. We also hear the same vacuum sound during the climactic killing of the child. The lady in the Radiator resides in, you guessed it, a radiator, which seems to represent folds of a symbolic labia. That fact that she appears in an elevator opening to a warm, damp interior space all but confirms this. Surrounding this radiator is hair-like thatch, making the radiator even more vaginal. The same type appears in Blue Velvet, right beside the closet where Jeffrey peeps on Dorothy. One of Lynch's biggest influences is Edward Hopper, who uses radiators as vaginal signifiers in some of his paintings, such as Automat and Night Windows. So the likelihood this is a symbol of sexual desire is more than probable. Well, who's the man on the planet? Well, he resides in an egg. He pushes levers that seem to spur on the biological mechanisms of creation. He resides in an enclosed space, and so that's what it probably is. If he's in an egg, he's a baby on the way. Just our symbolic egg is unhatched. But the man is a scary-looking fellow. Well, I believe that's for good reason. It's because fatherhood is scary. David Lynch is referencing Frankenstein here and the horror of creation. The black and white camera stock is a reference to 30s, 40s, 50s creature features. I would probably chalk the black and white aesthetic to budget as well, but the monster mashes of Lynch's youth would make its way in The Elephant Man as well, which seems to take heavy inspiration from that genre of movie. The man on the planet is a monster to Henry, but a monster of his own conception. A good indicator of this homage is the pushing of the levers, the Bride of Frankenstein hairdo Henry has, and let's not forget the marketing poster. Henry here looks like Boris Karloff. David Lynch has always been a fan of Frankenstein. Actually, one of his first short films was called Absurd Encounter with Fear. It's kind of a postmodern stew, equal parts James Joyce's An Encounter and the little girl scene in Frankenstein.
Shoot!
Now, of course, monetarily, it makes sense why David Lynch wants to not disclose the meaning of his films. His films rely on word of mouth, and he wants discussion to continue. Makes perfect sense. I trust that he does it also out of respect for the viewing party, and of course his artistic integrity, allowing the work to speak for itself. But I doubt that David Lynch will ever disclose the meaning of Eraserhead, because the film relies on the audience to gauge the efficacy of the act of killing a half-born baby. I think in its final moments, what Eraserhead is really asking of its audience is whether or not the Frankenstein's monster that is the child is really a monster. So, in that same vein, let's look at the baby. Baby hardly looks like a baby at all. It looks like an egg. Its body looks like a loaf of bread wrapped in linens, as the wrapping gives the baby a breaded, lame, striped look, most likely to signify the baby's bountifulness. Since it rests on a table, it further takes on a symbolic connection with food, which is something that families gather around to enjoy together. The baby is introduced to us not liking the baby formula. It seems to prefer bread. The loaf of bread is placed next to the child in a black bowl, similar to the bountiful large tossed salad we see on the X's dinner table, a salad mixed by mother and daughter. 1980s Japanese promotional poster for Eraserhead seems to hint at this as well. It depicts a literal piece of bread wrapped in gauze in lieu of the baby, signifying that a bountiful piece of bread is one and the same with Henry's bun in the oven. Another food symbol here are the dogs that are most likely depicted with unnerving, unnatural rat-like sounds, not because of their biological mechanisms of pregnancy being grotesque, as many critics seem to point out, but rather Henry's distaste for parenting itself. Our major tell is that Henry seems to be grossed out by the food here. Food is Eraserhead's largest underlying motif. In fact, the first time we see the child is when Mary attempts to feed it. We find that Mary is disgusted, much like Henry is with the dogs. The dog's placement in the film is important too, as in just a few moments of screen time, the infamous chicken scene takes place, furthering the food parallel. Families are known to conversate and dine at the dinner table, and to ritualistically bond with one another, much like a mother's in nursing their babies is also a form of bonding with one another. Henry takes a beautiful and natural thing and perverts it, much like a carving of a meal. While the baby possesses Henry's head, the possession isn't meant to be taken literally. Almost nothing here is supposed to be taken literally. When the baby possesses Henry's head for the first time, it most likely is meant to symbolize Henry's oncoming duties as a father, being that the baby crowns its way from his neck, giving him a new identity as a father figure. The second being a metaphor for how the girl across the hall perceives Henry with the baby on the way. Other than this instance, which is a metaphor, the beautiful girl across the hall sees the child differently than Henry does, seeing it only in its egg form as it progresses towards her like a meteor, making her not want a relationship with Henry. Another indication that the child has yet to be born. This doesn't mean the child is in any way malicious in the narrative, much like John Merrick of The Elephant Man. The child's only crime is that it was born, and much like Merrick, the baby most likely wants nothing more than a family. But for Henry, a vacationing printer, it represents a great sacrifice of freedom. Henry seems dedicated to other pursuits than parenting. At no point in his dream narrative he's even seen holding, feeding, or stating that he loves the child. At one point, he smothers it with his hand in order to keep it from crying, and not to alert his extramarital love interest, as if to keep the oncoming child a secret. Mary X2 lashes out in anger at the child after it cries through the night, taking on traits of the abusive dog-like parents and the grandmother. She quickly abandons the child, leaving Henry to take care of it. She extracts a suitcase from under the bed as the baby in a uterus-shaped chair is seen behind her. In our dream narrative, it remains a mystery what the symbolic child really cries for, as it rejects food. Perhaps it's in pain, as its inner organs are just a couple cuts away from being spread out on the table. But our best clue is that the baby stops crying whenever Henry is near it. So perhaps it desires the safety that others provide, or it desires love. We hear the man on the planet laugh through a window. Windows are objects of freedom in Eraserhead. A bricked window is the most prominent symbol of this. The man on the planet laughs when Henry gets news of the baby, so the man on the planet is probably an embodiment of the baby on the way, and how Henry views the baby. It flips switches like an oncoming train, a train that Henry's dog-like disposition wants to avoid.
I saw it coming. I'm sorry, I did. You gotta swing your hips now.
Karma is 100% an aspect of Eraserhead. A good argument could be made that the baby is a reflection of Henry's bad birth after this life that he lives. Just take for example when Henry turns his back on the baby. The meaning of the scene is pretty clear cut. Don't turn your back on your incoming child, or you will bring about a sickness of bad birth. This framing of Henry and the baby spells it out for us. They are reflected in the frame as if these two are one and the same. The sickness of the karmatic baby could be also why the man on the planet could have all those polyps and look sick himself. But does this mean that we are only talking about karma here and discount any other subtext, specifically that of an oncoming baby? No, the baby is still the main conflict of the film, but karma is part of Eraserhead. Like, take a look at this bum here. I'm going to use the name Bum because it's the name in the credits. He very well might be another life of Henry. The big black prison bars on his clothing is our big takeaway. The framing of his head is our main tell. It could be another life, or it could be Henry in the future, regretting his decisions that led up to his life now. So the lady in the Radiator. Does Henry go to heaven at the end, experiencing good rebirth? Henry doesn't commit suicide. He kills the baby. He doesn't kill himself, so I don't think so. The lady in the Radiator is a symbol of heavenly desire, of consequence-free sexuality. She dresses up like Marilyn Monroe, an object of desire for many men. And to desire is to suffer, and to suffer is not blissful. At least this is what it is in Hindu philosophy. If we got a fish in our percolator, it tastes like red herring. That empty, what the fuck just happened, that empty cut to black, that's how it's supposed to make you feel. Henry is able to pursue his goals by the stopping of the oncoming child.
Told me that. He says, Jack, one of these days guys are going to be trying to get their hair. And at which time I told him, well, that's when I'm going to leave the country.
Henry's hair stands tall and erect. Hair is a continual motif throughout the world of Eraserhead. It grows where you least expect it. We will find all across Eraserhead's world hair-like objects surrounding orifices, beside vaginal warm and wet radiators, over dresser drawers, etc. The hair that is displayed so prominently in Eraserhead's world is a stand-in for the pubic-like hair that surrounds one's privates, and therefore a one-to-one symbol of sexuality and desire. Much of Lynch's art also uses this signal. Look at this phallic hair-like object ejaculating in this surreal portrait of insemination. Henry's hair is constantly at a point of attention. Perhaps this is the signal to the audience where his thoughts truly lie below the surface. When Henry meets Mary's parents for the first time, Mary goes into spastic fits. Here, Mrs. X combs Mary's hair in order to calm her. Mrs. X, the witch-like mother, is safely guarding and conservative, and always keeping Mary's hair straight. During Mary X's spastic night fit scene, her hair is drenched in wetness, signifying her desire and sexual frustration. She has these fits while pushing Henry out of the bed, a symbol of their overall relationship. Because Mary X is a woman under conservative guardianship of her mother, it is important to Mary to keep the societal expectation of her virginity. Hence why her mother keeps such a watchful eye in how she presents herself. A good interpretation of the chicken bleeding scene is that it echoes the horror of Mary having to tell her parents that she lost her virginity.
Excuse me.
A possible inspiration could be Sylvia Plath's bell jar and Esther's trauma during her first time. The hair of the beautiful girl next door is erect, much like Henry's. The beautiful girl next door is a similarly promiscuous character. Henry's hair takes another important function, a function that can be seen in the very first shot of the film. This being that of a nest. Later, we will see Lynch frame Mary as having a bird's nest for a head in the Meet the Parents scene. We see brains as eggs all over the work of David Lynch, but we also see it in the dinner scene where The daughter Mary springs forth from Mr. X's noggin like a tree. Having a child could be very well why Mr. X has lost his mind. More about Bill in a minute. Recall later that Henry gets a nosebleed upon learning that he has an unannounced baby on the way. He looks to be crying in his own way opposite Mary. But a nosebleed is blood escaping from an orifice, blood escaping from his head. And you might have missed it here, but you probably already seen an egg as head metaphor, just didn't have the correct context. It's in this photo with the pipe-smoking David Lynch with a little Jen on his knee, a Venus de Milo sprouting forth from her head. Not Athena, but close enough, and a signifier of her perceived beauty. We see the world through Henry's eyes. For instance, the family dinner table is framed oddly here, and I don't mean framed in terms of cinematic framing, I mean set design. Now, it's almost if the dining room is framed as a mushroom cloud. The nuclear family is nuclear Armageddon to Henry, the end of the world, and for most part, with few symbolic exceptions, this is Henry's dream. Lady in the Radiator is filmed quite differently than The Man on the Planet. She's uncanny, but she sings saccharine tunes on the surface, speaking of being fine and being in heaven, and she does fun little dances. She's secretly the villain in the film's eyes, giving Henry the courage to kill the baby, but just looking at internet comments about her and friends' opinions on her, her smile to most people isn't a deceptive smile. To most people, it's just bad acne. Henry here looks at the radiator and then looks at the baby. He then decides to kill the child with a pair of scissors. This is basic cinematic language. Like, there has been some confusion as to what Laura is looking at here in this scene within Fire Walk With Me. Is it an angel, or is it a mysterious out-of-frame television set? Well, we can tell by Eyeline. She looks at Cooper. Cooper looks at her. She looks at the angel. We see the angel. Most likely, it's not an off-screen television. David Lynch just equates electricity with spiritual energy, and the angel is in a heavenly glow here. Eyeline. Basic, but essential to the cinematic language of film. Of course, one interpretation. I'll get into that Twin Peaks rabbit hole one day, and thankfully it's less ugly of a subject to talk about. As for now, what's important here is that we have an understanding of what motivates Henry, and that's the radiator. So, speaking of mushroom clouds, recall that Henry has a picture of a nuclear bomb hanging over the only life that resides in his home, a wilted, unpotted plant beside his bedside, possibly meant to signify the baby. Also, recall that when Henry is on, well, I'll just call it trial, in front of the man on the planet, after touching the hands of the lady in the radiator, the plant bleeds from its lower half. And again, I want to remind you that trees are a form of growth here. A bleeding tree, especially from its lower mound, reminds us of a bleeding of chickens, bleeding of the nose, bleeding of the baby. So these objects hold symbolic attachment to the child, whether it be the undercooked chickens, which links to the undercooked bun in the oven that is Henry's child. This pairing then tells us that the chicken's bleeding mirrors the baby's bleeding. This also goes for the tree, which is a symbol of growth, pairs with the symbol of growth that is the child itself, and the tree's bleeding mirrors the baby's bleeding. Henry's nose bleeding mirrors the baby bleeding, because Henry's head is seen to be a nest, and a nosebleed is bleeding from an orifice from where his egg brain is. We're going to have to talk about Todd McGowan and his Marxist interpretation of the film, but Lynch is no Marxist. He's a right-wing libertarian who votes all over the place, but leaned right during the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. and much more leftward, perhaps centrist now. But at least in my mind and how I analyze his art, due to how he gives the fetuses in his art sentience and expression, he most likely views unborn children to fall under what right libertarians call the no-harm principle. Whether he thinks legislation should be enacted towards this, I don't know. So, there's a tracking shot that follows Henry during his walk home. It's one of the very few moments of camera movement in the entire film. We stalk him outside of the factory, where large electrical components sit behind him in a fenced area. We don't hear what Henry hears, but something causes him alarm. This is most likely a way to indicate to the audience that the city is a place of danger, but I have another theory. Much has been made about the factory environments and alienating world of Eraserhead. Some critics, such as Todd McGowan, seek to pair alienation under capitalism with Eraserhead's factory machinery. True, in Eraserhead, David Lynch and Alan Split use factory noises to create an alienating space for the viewer. But when we hear these noises of factory machinery, we are not supposed to think of literal economic means of production, rather symbols of material life-giving production. The soundtrack that orchestrates Henry's misery is a natural progression from the mechanical man in the planet and his levers. David Lynch is into photographing broken down factories, and it makes sense why. Take, for instance, Blue Green, a short film during his Inland Empire era, named after Baby Blue or Fireman's Water, which is also blue, a Wicked Witch Lime Green, which contrasts it. This color pair will become more important as we explore his later works in later videos, but what's important here is how Lynch frames factories. Factories in the world of David Lynch seems to be a symbol of biological mechanisms of creation. Pointing his camera at the broken and shut down factories, filming a woman in distress in search of her baby coated in sickly green, while a man, possibly the father in a trench coat, lurks in the shadows, a dress of sexual perversion. Henry has a trench coat that Lynch nicknamed Uncle Edgar. We know this from the Kenneth Godwin interviews back in the 1980s. Uncle Edgar is a reference to Edgar Allan Poe and Uncle Fester, who is a light bulb biter. Edgar Allan Poe, a Philadelphia native, Lynch says that his time in Philly inspired him, living in the ghettos. But Edgar Allan Poe is most famous for his poem The Raven, where a hellish creature tells a madman nevermore. This trench coat also hangs beside a door that leads to the beautiful girl across the hall, as if to say, nevermore. When we first see the trench coat, we see it hanging where the baby will soon be. He has to hang up his trench coat for the baby to lie down, one for the other. In the baby killing scene, Henry faces away towards the camera, which mirrors the trench coat, which makes it look like the trench coat is killing the baby. The back alley abortionists also wear trench coats. So let's elaborate more on this bum guy. This bum is not in the same geographical position as the kid. We know this because of our own two eyes, and the fact that Lynch states this in his autobiography, Room to Dream. David Lynch states that the bum is hanging out on a bus stop bench, which should give us pause, considering there shouldn't be a bus stop bench in a back alley. It's curious that the kid doesn't see the bum, but the bum sees the kid and reaches out for the kid, as if he wants to stop the kid. The reaching out kind of reminds us of the same reaching motion Mrs. X, the soon-to-be grandmother, does when she tries to save the chickens. This weird cross-cutting between the two distant subjects is 100% Fellini. Lynch is a big fan of Fellini. Who isn't? Take, for example, the scene in The Layabouts. Two subjects, two geographical positions, implying an imagined passing by. Lynch might one-up Fellini here, and does something pretty cool. He frames two subjects in two geographical positions in two karmatic lives.
Look at me and tell me if you've known me before. Yes, we will do that.
So, a lot of our thematic framing into karma and the interactions between past and previous lives are hallmarks of his later work, and they will be best exemplified in other videos. So I recommend in the intro you go and explore these things for yourself, and because in my opinion karma kind of takes a back seat in Eraserhead, we will build that foundation later. But as for now, there's things worth mentioning here. Notice the bum is resting his head on a paper sack filled with plucked chicken feathers, being that the man-made chickens represent our baby, and Henry brings in a paper sack at the beginning of the film filled with wrapped bread, pairing the paper sack and the wrapped bread with his bun in the oven. It seems that these props were deliberate. The girl across the hall enters strangely. She appears out of nowhere. No sound alerts her to her presence, with the exception of her voice, as if she was imagined.
Are you Henry?
Yes.
We hear the elevator's doors close behind Henry, but we don't hear the beautiful girl across the hall entryway open, a sound right next to Henry that should be audible. Now, Henry is an okay-looking guy, but the way the girl seems to be infatuated with Henry throughout the course of the narrative is hard to believe, judging by Mary, the only other girl that Henry has had sex with that we know of. He doesn't exactly attract the most beautiful girls. Charlotte Stewart, the actress who played Mary, made an effort to make herself look ugly for the role. She is depicted as sickly, meek, and pitiful. It appears that the girl across the hall is more of a symbol than a character, a symbol of lack. Henry is seen fiddling with a lock when he first meets with the girl. The last time he sees the girl is through the same lock as she and Mr. Roundheels shut the door, presumably to have sex. In this case, the keyhole being an orifice seems to be a symbol of Henry's sexual frustration, a theme that will become more and more prevalent as the film goes on, probably being that Henry has an anxiety of getting locked out of future relationships and sexual encounters. This can be reaffirmed by how the beautiful girl sleeps with Henry in a dreamlike sequence, making an excuse of being locked out of her apartment, a reversal of how Henry gets locked out from the beautiful girl's apartment at the end of the film.
I locked myself out of my apartment.
The beautiful girl across the hall looks her part. If the bubbly, blonde, blistered-faced girl in the Radiator is Marilyn Monroe, the all-too-perfect, beautiful girl across the hall seems to be Betty Davis. The seductive girl across the hall's hair resembles a large growth of thatch, much like Henry's own hair. Her clothes are designed splashed with white, similar to the white semen-like substance we saw in the pool in our opening sequence. She is made up exceptionally well for just hanging around the apartment. As we learn later, she entertains other men, such as the devilish Mr. Roundheels. Perhaps this indicates that she is seeing someone. From a writer's perspective, it would be much more forward to just have a common dialogue between Henry and Mary over the phone, where Mary invites him over to her parents and is vague as to the reasons why. However, Lynch goes for a different approach. If we are to view the beautiful girl across the hall as some symbolic manifestation of Henry's desire for sex, this scene would seem to be written as a way to communicate the contrast between what Henry as a character wants with a juxtaposition of what fatherhood lacks. That all that he desires is all that he has to sacrifice. The fantasy quality of the girl then continues to how she moves. Notice the slowness of how the girl across the hall closes her door, an action that seems too long and too drawn out not to be deliberate. This is one of the few actions that is seen to us but not to Henry, a rarity throughout the course of the film. Right below the 27 apartment number, we can see little scratches on the door similar to what a dog would make as if wanting to come from outside. It would make sense if this was just incidental, as this particular set was constructed, but dogs are symbols of male promiscuity in Eraserhead, and it wouldn't be too far off. David Lynch has cited Edward Kienholz as one of his favorite artists. Lynch has homaged his works in many of his films, for instance in Wild at Heart's car crash scene, which bears a striking similarity to Kienholz's masterpiece, Five Card Stud. But it would seem that Lynch has made explicit reference to Kienholz in the baby killing scene by way of homaging his 1962 work, Legal Operation. The connection of a drab, dirty, dimly lit, moody setting with standing light fixtures are more than just coincidence. The torn feminine pillow is also present in Eraserhead's symbolic abortion, by means of a chair shaped as a diagram of women's anatomy. This uterus-shaped chair also makes an appearance at the X's dinner table, which Mrs. X holds as she asks to speak with Henry in the hall. Right next to this chair is another that looks similar to the Radiator that he has in his apartment.
Henry, may I speak to you a minute?
The most overt of our uterus symbols comes from the back alley Eraserhead factory, with a uterus framing pencil erasers as they go down a conveyor belt.
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism. Eat shit. Filth are my politics. Filth is my life. Take whatever you like.
It was John Waters, the director of the trash classic Pink Flamingos, that was one of the greatest cheerleaders for Eraserhead, saying it was his favorite film. Sadly, the curation of Eraserhead alongside films such as Pink Flamingos, a film with a unapologetic, incestuous family, goes against many of the themes Lynch was attempting to convey about the family unit in his own film. so it seemed to taint many of the critics' reactions to it. It comes as no great surprise that even today, no one has agreed to its meaning. It just came out at the wrong place.
Okay, old buddy. Action. Special Agent Dale Cooper here, sending out a great big hello from everyone at Twin Peaks to all the Allied forces out there in the Middle East.
Another roadblock to the works of David Lynch is that just because they are subversive doesn't mean that he values subversive qualities. If anything, he seems to value equilibrium. And with these two choke points, both its historical distribution and its strange styling, one could easily see why people would be confused.
What was David Lynch like to work with?
Well, it's not that he's weird, he's just kind of so, you know, apple pie in a way. Do you know what I mean? When I met him, well, he's very, well, you know, doggone it, I don't understand what, you know, what the heck just happened. That's the kinds of things that he'll say, you know. It's like, what, David? You know? Or Sherilyn, that was Jim Dandy. Like, okay, I guess that means it was good, huh, Dave? You know, he's real kind of straight in a way, which is kind of odd because it's that, you know, that paradox. He seems so straight, but then he's got all these strange things going on in his head.
Okay, so now we're talking about the seed. The seed comes immediately after Henry gets news that he's a father. It comes through mail in a tiny little package, much like a tiny Christmas present. Now, the way he opens the package that houses the seed is weird because he goes outside to open it. Now, there are two important details. Windows are of importance in Eraserhead. Henry has a bricked window in his apartment, and most of the windows in Eraserhead are broken, signaling broken nihilistic outlooks of the characters that peer through them. But when Henry goes outside, next to him is an open window, the very few that we see in the whole film. So naturally, an open window signifies freedom to Henry. Now, on the other side of the shot, we have something a bit more interesting. If you squint your eyes a bit, you'll see the number 27 there. Now, where have we seen that before? These seeds represent our incoming child. It would make sense because he puts in his little uterus cabinet that has flowers that look much like ovaries. In the dinner scene, there is a ceramic dog that is pouncing in one of these seeds while he cuts the chicken, another abortion parallel. The male cubbies, since they are orifices, might signal vaginas and Henry's invitation to the girl next door. Henry seems to be making the decision to terminate his seed in order to receive some mail from the girl next door.
Where's your wife?
I'm not sure.
So we already discussed the sperm being pulled out of Mary, and how she was originally going to be cracked open like an egg, as if Henry was aborting the makeup of the child directly from Mary, and then throwing this makeup of the child against the wall, killing it. What's interesting here is that the seed transforms into a more phallic-like object after being cast on by a spotlight. Spotlights were what introduced the lady in the Radiator, our abortion personification. Since the seed transforms into a phallic object, going in and out of holes, this seems to signify Henry's ability to continue his sexual pursuits. This ends with the phallic object turning into a vaginal orifice, which allows us entrance to Henry's masturbation fantasy to the girl next door. Let's talk about the introductory sequence. We avoided it up to this point, but because we have a lot of the puzzle pieces out of the way, it's less intimidating. For instance, we already know that this is an egg. So the way we descend upon the egg like a sperm, and then inside the egg through this little house, is actually meant to signal insemination. Henry has his eyes wide open for an unnaturally long period of time throughout this sequence, almost a full minute. This gives Henry a fish-like appearance. The movement of Henry is in a buoyant fashion as well, like a fish against the water, or more likely a sperm moving towards its egg. Either way, both sperm and fish are known as swimmers. This may signify his mentality to be something primordial, much like the microscopic sperm creatures that appeared from his mouth. Further evidence of our sperm parallel is in the way Henry's tie is shaped. When it comes into frame, it resembles the tail of a sperm, and Henry's head being the head nuclei of the creature. Much like a sperm under a microscope, Henry is just as transparent. Henry's positioned horizontally here, the same way the sperm emerges from Henry's mouth. This horizontal placement could imply that he's in a position for dreaming, sleep, or for sex. And with the buoyancy of his body, he could also signal the act of sex itself. So everything else here is pretty straightforward. The Frankenstein-style pulling of levers that have the sperm fall into a vaginal puddle is self-explanatory. But what interests me is the water bubbling. Now take a look at the eraser dust, a perversion of this original image that came at least an hour earlier. Water is normally a sign of life. Dry dust is antithetical to this. So we see something emerge from a hole, and then we see Henry looking back at the audience with dread. Henry saw what we just saw. These events are not narratively divorced from him. For example, say a story with another location and events are happening separately to another character.
Laura, sweetheart, I'm not going to tell you again. Yes, I am.
A good example is Sarah from Twin Peaks, seeing the necklace being taken. She's reacting to what we just saw, just like Henry is reacting to the events that we just saw. We see Henry reacting in dread to something in the fourth wall because he is reacting to the previous scene of a baby emerging into a white light. This signals that the previous scene was a product of Henry's imagination and not a series of events separate to Henry and where he's standing now. In terms of narrative, it's just a daydream. But as to why he is looking over his shoulder, this is to clue us into the fact that the child is incoming. Henry stands in the same position at the end of the film, where he halts the oncoming pregnancy. Just take a look. So we never really see a baby being born. We only see Henry imagine a baby being born. And that's future tense, not past tense. When Henry steps into the puddle, his sock seems to enter the puddle, much like the sperm does moments before. An accident, much like the impregnation, which is also an accident. But the wet sock doubles as something else. Henry is on the edge of the bed here. He will be seen on the edge of the bed later on, picking off what seems to be semen off his pajama knees. The beautiful girl across the hall sleeping with Henry being all the clues that we need to tell us that this is just a fantasy. So if he's reflected in a puddle on the other side of the bed masturbating at one point in the film, it should clue us in subconsciously that he's doing the same here. Now, it is common that men use socks as cleanup after masturbation, which is most likely what Henry is doing here. Henry throws his literal cum sock onto the radiator, heating it and killing the sperm, much like the lady in the Radiator who would kill the sperm in her dance sequence later on in the film. This imagery is duplicated when Henry does it here. Behind Henry is a dresser drawer, that is framed with his head. Inside this headspace is a picture of Mary, which is what he could be masturbating to. Later on in the film, he will be taking out scissors of the same headspace when he decides to kill the baby. On the way back home, Henry walks into an elevator. The elevator fails to start. Electric lightning bolts are on the carpet here, and why they may be connected to the womb-like elevator will be clear in a minute. Just make note of the symbolic balanced radiance that is emanating from the elevator here. Just a little side note, there are vine wallpapers hanging in the lobby. Vines will be important during the dinner scene. The elevator doors also have strange hanging grotesques that mirror ovaries. When Henry goes inside the womb-like elevator, lights flicker on and off like a heartbeat, struggling to survive.
I have a secret.
The blowing out of electricity in the films of David Lynch is normally framed as a signifier of death. For instance, in Blue Velvet, after the climax in Dorothy's apartment where Jeffrey kills Frank, 3 light bulbs go out, signaling the extinguishing of the life force of Frank Booth, Dawn, and the yellow-jacketed man. Similarly, in Eraserhead, the killing of the baby also leads to a spiritual extinguishing in the form of a light bulb going out at the end of the film. The child is also paired with electricity by its onset naming. Originally, someone had named the baby prop Lightbulb, and then Spike, most likely Lynch himself, most likely because the baby looks similar to a light bulb. Its egg-shaped head is bulbishly shaped, and its body is wrapped like a screw. Light bulbs, like children, are full of light, and therefore spiritual in their bounty. When we see the lady in the Radiator, her spotlights are peculiar. She is not lit by normal means. She is lit up by light bulbs on the floor. When she stomps on each sperm as they drop to the ground, the sperms are positioned in proximity to the light bulbs, as if she is symbolically smashing the light bulbs.
The dog crawls, the socket drips. Disease. Hot. Electricity.
The dog crawls, lights blow out, a wind, dark, smiling teeth, a swollen tongue. The dog crawls, the socket drips.
Rabbits in David Lynch's Rabbits recite poetry of light bulbs blowing out. We'll discuss these bunnies in a later video, but it's worth mentioning. Now, I have written the next section at least 14 times. There are so many moving parts. There are so many things to cover, so I just decided to run through the whole Meet the Parent sequence, ending with the most important thematic section of the film last, which is the grandmother, and then leave you with that. So, before even Henry reaches the ex's house, something of interest happens. When Henry walks along the train tracks, he hears a junkyard dog. One could just take this as an omen for the events to the night to come. However, it may indicate something more. The dogs bark at Henry with the crash of a garbage can. Perhaps the dog was digging around where he shouldn't be. Is this the same dog that knocked up Mary X's dog? We don't see another around in the X's house. The dog also makes Henry jump off the tracks, derailing himself. Derailing is the ultimate fate of the man on the planet. This may be an omen after all, a warning of Henry's dog-like attitude derailing the pregnancy, and then possibly derailing himself. The area outside the ex's house is filled with smoke and poorly maintained sunflowers, which brave the weather of the mislaid pipes. When the plume of smoke hits the dead plants, Henry enters the frame. This is most likely no coincidence, as he will be killing a source of light at the end of the film's climax. Sunflowers are another symbol here.
Hiya, Sonny. What do you got there?
Worthy of note is Mary X extracting the suitcase underneath the bed, a sunflower bag in her hand. Behind her, a womb-like chair and the baby, as if she's extracting a metaphorical child. The meeting of these two give us a wonderful reversal of Romeo and Juliet and their balcony scene, which gives emphasis to their intertwining destiny via the man and the planet, or the unborn child. Yet they are hardly star-crossed lovers. Henry almost didn't come. Mary is angry with Henry and scolds him for being late, even though she never actually set a time. Henry tells her, "You never come around anymore." There are few words spoken in Eraserhead, which leaves every line meaningful. "You never come around" speaks to the casualness of their relationship, insinuating that perhaps Henry and Mary's relationship was of coming and going, as one pleases. But to come around is also what the rickety phonograph does, and phonograph music is a vital part of Eraserhead, with its organ sounds repetitive and jovial, like a merry-go-round. You get the same feeling from the sing-song saccharine qualities of the lady in the Radiator as well, her voice teetering and tottering with each uneasy note. Pay attention to the grooves of the record here, and how they sound much like the ricketing of a bed. The turning of a phonograph is similar to the turning of the samsara, a karmatic cycle of death and rebirth. The fact that the film associates the music as sexual, as well as associating it with the continual cycle of death and rebirth, seems to indicate that this continuing of promiscuous behavior and bad rebirth is one and the same. Phonograph music is what is played when the beautiful girl across the hall and Mr. Roundheels are in room 27 having sex. Perhaps Henry was musing about better times when he was walking across those tracks, but more likely he was thinking about getting lucky. Back to the conversation at hand, Henry uses a strange verbiage here. "I didn't know that you wanted me to come or not, and you never come around anymore." Both of these sentences underline the word coming, which harkens to the both of the absence of another as well as the slang for sexual climax. This is undoubtedly intentional subconscious wording, perhaps pertaining to the last time Henry and Mary had sex, in which he accidentally came without her permission. When we see Mrs. X for the first time, she looks like the Wicked Witch. Lynch made her ugly for the role. You see that drooping eye and wart? That's prosthetic. Mrs. X is cold in her greeting here when she first meets Henry. When Mrs. X instructs Henry to sit, she instructs with a stern demeanor, like how she would instruct a dog. When he sits, he seems to sit too comfortably. Meanwhile, Mary X sits on the edge of the couch, far from where Henry chooses to sit. Henry sits in between loose-fitting cushions, which Henry penetrates through the middle. Henry also fingers the couch in a suggestive manner, stroking it quite clumsily. Meanwhile, Mary X and her mother both have their hands over their genitals in a guarded position. Right next to Mrs. X is a flower lamp. Resting below the flower lamp is a sunflower-laced fabric, the same type of lace that will be laid on the dinner table, meant to symbolize family and the family unit. This is 1-to-1 with our tree that also sits on a lace fabric. Behind the glaring light bulbs are flower-like stems, reminiscent of electricity and reminiscent of the tree. An electricity that Mrs. X seems to be guarding. Positioned by the mother are dogs. They're stationed near a bunch of cubbies similar to the ones we see in Henry's downstairs apartment. It would appear that all the drawers are filled with twigs and nature, signifying pubic hair, perhaps a commentary on Henry's animal urges that got him into the situation. Perhaps a commentary on Henry's doggedness that will lead Henry to infidelity, mirroring the subplot with the seed. Moving back to the conversation at hand, Mrs. X asks, "What do you do?" Henry responds that he's on vacation, which could speak to the fact that he might not be employed. However, as we discussed previously, this can be taken as something symbolic. A vacation is a time and place free from responsibility, and printing is an act of permanence. Upon his response, we see Mary looking at him, and then to her mother, as if worrying of her disapproval. Henry doesn't seem to help matters much when he continues to fumble for a response. She clarifies, "What did you do?" Mary, most likely hearing it as an innuendo, because Henry did her, has a seizure. She grabs her left knee and makes a weird chimp-like noise.
Bullshit. Are you calling me a liar? I know why the chicken crossed the road. This conversation just came to a screeching halt.
Monkeys in the art of David Lynch seems to signal the unenlightened. They are often paired with people behind masks, as if unable to discern from what we call reality, from what David Lynch considers the real. This is principles of the Maya, the illusionary state that they're infatuated with. We'll get into that more when we talk about Twin Peaks, when we talk about After Henry explains that he is a printer, Mr. X walks in. Notice too that a long black pipe impedes the frame of a nuclear family dinner table, as if it was carrying toxicity into the home. This pipe later on will be used to frame actors as they talk about the baby, literally dividing them. We know that this is Henry's phallic pipe here, because Henry was seen entering into the frame earlier with the toxic plume. There is a symbolic connection between Henry's bed and the black pipe that protrudes through the X's house. Notice the similarities between Mary's framing here and Mary's extracting of a suitcase.
You don't mind, do you, Henry? I mean, about getting married?
When we see Bill for the first time, both his hands are on the table. It takes him a full minute to remove them from it, almost as if he was aggressively guarding it. The table is almost as big as the room itself, signifying its importance for the family unit. Bill here presents to us why Henry's world looks the way it does. When Bill hears that Henry is a printer, a trade of permanence and copying, Bill replies with anger, perhaps knowing firsthand the dangers of mindless printing.
Printing's your business, huh? Plumbing's mine. 30 years. I've seen this neighborhood change from pastures to the hellhole it is now. I put every damn pipe in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
Bill. And people think pipes grow in their home. Well, they sure as hell don't. Look at my knees. Look at my knees.
It would seem that Bill's job as a plumber is to fix pipes, to stop leakage. When Bill says that his pipes are fixed, this angers the dogs as if in disagreement. Bill, probably knowing more than he lets on, seems to be yelling at Henry for his mindless printing. It goes without saying, when a generation of children doesn't look after their children, then it's everyone's problem. With increase in teen pregnancy, crime, and drug use, another toxicity permeates the air. The problem Eraserhead seems to be highlighting here with Bill's speech is that many adults in child-rearing roles would rather sleep around than be a parent to their own children, or seek preventative measures such as wearing a condom so their pipes don't leak. This speech is climaxed with the rumbling of machinery overhead, and Mary and Mrs. X calling out to Bill as if he said something offensive, as if he expressed some sort of sentiment that is better off unspoken to Henry. Here at the end of Bill's greeting to Henry, he shouts, "Look at my knees." Later on in the film, Henry is spotted on the side of the bed, picking off what may be dried semen on his pajama knees. So while this is traditionally thought of a reference to how Bill is on his hands and knees all the time fixing pipes, it's far more likely a reference to masturbation as a way to curb sexual urges rather than acting upon them. This reference to masturbation seems to have offended Mrs. X, and she chases him away. In the dining room, we can spot a tailless fish on a large board similar to the small chickens on a large dinner plate, which is in no way a small detail. Lynch points to these fish in interviews as one of the few items that he took home as a souvenir and makes sure to point out its tailless quality. The mounting of a fish, most likely by Bill, would seem that the X's value things even if they are small, such as a baby or a small chicken with big knives to cut it. It's bountiful.
I had an operation on my arm here. Doctors said I wouldn't be able to use it. Well, what the hell do they know, I said. And I rubbed it for a half hour every day. And then I got so I could move it a little. And I got so I could turn a faucet. And pretty soon I had my arm back again. Now I can't feel a damn thing in it. All numb.
Bill's arm story is one of the most obscure non sequiturs in Lynch's canon, but it's most likely a reference to his neutering to curb his dog-like appetite in order to better take on the role as a father. Bill plumbs his pipes. He is a plumber after all. Since vasectomies weren't in vogue during the 70s, I think he's talking about a literal castration. He takes out his sexual frustrations by rubbing one out for half an hour every day. I don't know if this is common knowledge, but even eunuchs can masturbate, which was news to me. The problem, it seems, is that Bill has been masturbating a bit too much, and it causes his arm to go numb. By not going astray from his role as a father, Bill gained the ability to turn on the faucet. The turning of a faucet reminds us of the turning of the Dharma Chakra, symbolizing that Bill here will be greeted with good rebirth by fulfilling his duties as a father figure.
I'm Bill.
This could be reaffirmed by the tailless fish mounted on the wall. Much like Bill, the patriarch who most likely mounted the fish, this poor fish is unable to use his fin. I think there's a joke to be made about there being something wrong with Bill's swimmers. But I don't think Bill sees it that way, since the fish sits on a mount, much like those tiny chickens sit on the dinner plate. This fish seems to be a great source of pride for Bill. During the preceding events to the dinner, at the oven, Bill tends to these tiny man-made chickens, painting them with a cooking brush like a true artist. Mrs. X makes the salad. She doesn't leave the grandmother out. Mrs. X puppets the grandmother's hand, mixing the greens, and slams the bowl of salad in the sink, seemingly frustrated about the burden her mother is to her. She then lights a cigarette, an ominous sight. The cigarette seems to indicate that her care might be slipping. Although our time with the X's are short, it would seem that the grandmother is the only one we know smokes for sure. Why practice giving the grandmother cigarettes in the first place? Wouldn't it be better if she didn't keep up the practice, or rather slow the practice in her old age? It's not like she can complain. Similar to how Henry kills his child, Mrs. X may be trying to kill her mother, but in a more slow fashion. It's no coincidence that cigarettes are reminiscent of the baby's thermometer here. Both situations have underlying themes of abandonment or care and sickness. Throughout the evening, the grandmother gets left behind to sit alone in the kitchen in the dark. When Bill takes out the undercooked man-made chickens, notice he makes no effort to turn off the oven, or close it for that matter. Mrs. X also makes no effort to monitor the grandmother while she smokes her cigarettes either, which could lead her to possibly burn herself. Oftentimes, Lynch films grandmothers as a symbol of warmth. Lynch's short film project prior to Eraserhead was called The Grandmother, in which the state of the family unit was so toxic, it leads to a young boy to grow a grandmother in his attic in hopes of seeking the love he deserves. The grandmother seems just as pessimistic as Eraserhead's vision of the family, which had the grandmother die from lack of care from the boy's parents, having the grandmother choked to death. The boy, who grew her, also dies after visiting his grandmother in a cemetery, distraught from his loss. Or perhaps there's something Freudian there. This is just one interpretation. Moving on to the salad itself, the salad is one of the most unusual items in Eraserhead's world, as most vegetation seems to have trouble growing in Henry's dystopia. Compare it to the sunflowers in the X's front yard, which barely stand due to being blown by steam from the surrounding industry. The bowl of salad here, since it's mixed by grandmother and brought forth to the table of the family unit in its seemingly fertile bountifulness, seems to symbolize the importance of the ritual of getting together at dinner. During the dinner scene, the members of the family are often framed with green stems behind them, as if they too are a form of vegetation. This family's dinner seems to be the last remnants of Bill's green pastures. Even after the cutting of the chicken, Mary X appears stem-like from Mr. X's head. Her hand sprouts from Mr. X like a tree, as if she's sprouting from the egg that was Bill's mind. What should be our main takeaway here from the mixed greens of the X's dinner is that the family and its union symbolizes a balanced, natural state. If we are to see each member of the family as stem-like, they too must be a symbolic arm of the greater whole. The fact that the grandmother is paralyzed and doesn't come out for dinner should alarm us. Although speaking no dialogue, the paralyzed grandmother in Eraserhead shows us the very thesis of what Eraserhead seemingly attempts to convey: the importance of the family and its deterioration. Contrast this with Mrs. X just moments later, confronting Henry with the news of a child. Our theme of the family unit deteriorating is displayed in its most terrible state, with the incestuous, dog-like kiss of Mrs. X. This as well as Henry seeking to escape the role of fatherhood. It would seem that Eraserhead's world has been corrupted. Well, there is seemingly redemption. Bill may have paid the price for his lustful actions. He came to a stop when he fathered Mary X. In short, he paid the bill. When dinner is ready, the cuckoo bird that springs from the clock is made of feathers. It may resemble what one would see if they cracked open a fertilized egg prior to it being fully grown. This furthering our undercooked chicken's parallel, which reminds us of a terminated pregnancy. The clock striking 8 is the same number as the baby's temperature when it gets sick, and an infinity sign turned sideways, perhaps signifying some sort of continual karmatic cycle. As discussed before, the thermometer parallels the cigarette being smoked by the grandmother. Sickness after sickness, a theme that has been explored ever since Lynch's first short film work, 6 Men Getting Sick. So what's Eraserhead about? The simplest terms. It's about the family unit and its deterioration. It's about the decision to keep a child, and whether it's moral or not, I personally see it as an anti-abortion film. That's my opinion. I believe that there is a lot to do with karma and the religious bad birth cycle. It talks about infidelity, but it seems to acknowledge when a relationship is not right. I see it as a political film, but more interested in the spiritual aspects rather than looking to change minds or change legislation. It's just too vague. It's an individual expression. In interviews, Lynch said that he most likely didn't think it would really get shown.
It's anything goes, you know, like if somebody sees it and wants to make a political film out of it, you know, they can do that, you know. It's fine with me, because it's not fair for me to say, oh, you didn't get it, you know, because the film is so abstract. But it's not just like throwing together abstract. It's meant to be abstract. It's meant to be that way abstract, you know. So it has a right kind of feeling to me, and it's an honest film, but it's very abstract. So it's not fair for me to say that's a definite, you know, way that has to be interpreted. Like, I think this place is beautiful, you know, and I think that a lot of things that other people think are ugly are beautiful. And if you look at them right, or if you're, you know, like, if they're sort of isolated and put in a different context, they can be seen as shapes and textures, and, you know, and they're beautiful. But if you see them for what they are, like we had this mouse, you know, in the film. It's not in there anymore, but like I put an air hair on it and got the fur off of it, right? And to me, that was really beautiful. And but to other people, they would see this sort of hairless mouse.
This is a humane mousetrap.
Okay. And it runs on about 15,000 volts, apparently. I'll
okay, and I
plug it in, just... No, okay.
Goes onto the teeter-totter, passes the fulcrum, and there you got a mouse.
Oh,
Right?
and now what do you do once you catch the mice?
You,
do you tag them and release them into the wild?
Majority in cases from Texas and Georgia said that the decision to end a pregnancy during the first 3 months belongs to the woman and her doctor.
Did we solve Eraserhead? Nah. You can't solve Eraserhead. Eraserhead is Eraserhead is Eraserhead. Do we at least know a bit more? Well, gee, I hope so. Will I do another one of these? Yeah, but shorter. I have multiple scripts in the works. I would like to do Twin Peaks, but there is so much misinformation out there, and it's going to be really long. I don't know if my sanity can really take it. There's only so much Lynch I can handle. But definitely, yes, definitely. But not soon, not all. Shorter projects. This one took since COVID hit. I've been bunkered down in Eraserhead land. I'm so glad to escape. What do I think of Eraserhead, though? I never want to watch it again. Ballpark estimate, I've seen it about 100 times for this book I'm writing. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's a bit problematic. I think I have a lot of problems with what David Lynch is saying as an artist. And I think he's a genius. I like his work, but some of his work with some of the themes in them, I'm not a huge fan. I didn't want this to be what Eraserhead was about. I went into this thinking it was about karma and family and infidelity, but it's also about abortion. Luckily, it's not about one thing. I really like the family unit stuff with the tree thing and everyone is a limb. I love that. Eraserhead is wonderful and strange and beautiful. I would categorize David Lynch as one of the greatest artists of my time. So, at the beginning of this video, I said something to the effect that you should be skeptical, and that my opinion is just my opinion. I want to leave you with that. If you saw Eraserhead or any of his works in a certain way, I cannot take that away from you. I bet I'll get essays of my own in the comments below. That's perfectly fine. Just argue in good faith. Now, I set up a Patreon. If you like what I'm doing, this would be incredible if I could get your support. I'm very excited about continuing doing this. If you can't do that, that's completely fine. But you could still help me out. You know, you've seen a YouTube video before. This is where I say hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon next to it. It's a small thing, but it makes my life a tiny bit easier. So in the meantime, this is David Lynch's Skeleton Key saying, help control the pet population. Plumb your pipes so they don't leak.